The transport ship moved silently through the smoky gray clouds of the war-zone skies, where the ground below stretched wide and wounded, covered in scars of past battles marked by deep craters, broken machines, and shattered earth under a blanket of quiet tension that said more than any voice could, as if the air itself held its breath, watching, waiting, knowing what was to come and what had already been. The visitors from the allied species looked through the reinforced glass of their observation. Their expressions unreadable, but their eyes filled with curiosity, mixed with something else, something closer to caution, or maybe even quiet fear. Leader, a tall, thin being named Larn, carried no weapons, only a recorder and a data slate. And his mind brimmed with questions built from centuries of knowledge, yet even he could not fully understand the strange reputation humans had built over the course of this long and bloody war, not for their strength, not for their technology, but for something else, something older, something deeper, a kind of fire that burned quietly behind their eyes. They had heard rumors of it, stories passed between species in hushed tones, about what humans did before the clash of metal and plasma, before the chaos of explosions and blood, a kind of ritual not written in any manual and not taught in military academies, something primal, something that echoed far back into the roots of their strange species. And now, for the first time, Larn and his fellow observers were here to see it for themselves. Their shuttle landed on the outer edge of the human forward base, and the ramp lowered into a wind heavy with ash and static from distant discharges. Soldiers in dark armor moved like shadows around the camp, speaking little, but always moving, always preparing. And yet their movements were not robotic. They had a rhythm, a silent pulse, like something unspoken linked them all together. A human officer greeted the alien delegation without ceremony. No greetings, no speeches, just a single nod before turning and walking ahead, and the aliens followed through corridors lined with flickering lights and metal walls stained with old marks. Some looked like burn patterns, others like handprints made in mud or dried blood. None were explained, and none were asked about, because something in the air had already begun to change. The group was led to a wide open space near the heart of the base, where a large, circular clearing had been carved out of the debris and rubble. Humans gathered there in silence, surrounding a tall wooden figure made from scavenged parts of broken weapons, helmets, shattered visors, old boots, even bones from fallen comrades. And they stood there shoulder to shoulder, facing the effigy, their expressions calm and unreadable, their eyes sharp and burning with quiet purpose. One soldier stepped forward and began humming a low tone. Soon others joined in, not singing, not chanting, but something in between, and the sound grew like a rising tide, slow and unstoppable, and strange symbols were drawn on the ground, symbols not from any known language, and the aliens watched, confused, unsure if this was ceremony, madness, or something far beyond their understanding. The air turned heavy as the humans began their ritual without words or rules. Each movement seemed chaotic and yet strangely coordinated, like every person knew their part, not through instruction, but through memory old as their blood and bones. And the observers felt it, without knowing how they felt, the weight, the sorrow, the rage, the acceptance of something final and absolute. Larn tried to make sense of it. He noted the pattern of their steps, the timing of the sounds, the placement of their hands as they raised them to the sky or pressed them to the earth, but the logic refused to reveal itself, and the more he watched, the less he understood. And in that growing confusion, he began to realize something that would not leave him for a long time. This was not just preparation. This was not just culture. This was transformation, and he could feel it in his bones, even though he was not human. And as the humans stood there, surrounded by fire and memory and silence, the first crack in Larn's certainty appeared, a small fracture in his belief that war was just strategy and math. And somewhere far beyond the base, the sound of distant thunder began to rise, not from the sky, but from the machines being prepared, the ground vehicles humming to life, the weapons being charged, the war drawing closer step by step, while the humans continued their ritual, untouched by fear, as If they had already made peace with whatever waited ahead, and Larn stood in silence among his companions, no longer sure whether they were observers or witnesses to something ancient and terrible, something beautiful and terrifying, something that no amount of data could ever truly explain. The quiet around the circle began to shift slowly like the calm before a storm, but not a storm of wind or rain, rather a storm of memory, grief, fire, and something else that had no true word in the languages spoken by stars and systems. The humans stood firm, their armor set aside, their faces bare, their eyes unblinking. And though no single voice commanded them, they moved as one, their bodies guided by something deeper than training, something old. Alien observers stood at the edge, their vision filled with smoke and flame and motion, but their minds struggled to process what they were witnessing. This was not disorder, nor was it mere ceremony. It was not a display for outsiders, yet they had been allowed here not to understand, but only to see, and in seeing, something inside them had already begun to change. One of the humans dipped his fingers into a bowl of dark liquid. It looked like ash mixed with oil. He traced the substance across his face in lines that curved downward over his cheekbones. Another followed, and another, until dozens of soldiers had covered their faces in marks that looked like tears made of fire. Not sadness exactly, not mourning exactly, something heavy or large. Man stepped into the center of the circle, his voice low but filled with weight. He began to speak, not in a shout, not in a speech, but in a tone like a whisper that carried across the space. He spoke of names, names of those who had fallen in past battles, names the others repeated one by one, and the air grew thicker with each memory, as if the names themselves held power on the circle. Others began placing objects near the base of the wooden figure, pieces of cloth, metal fragments, photos, worn tokens of luck, and small items whose meaning was clear only to the one who placed them there. A soldier bent down to leave a single worn boot, its sole torn and useless, but placed with care as if it belonged to a friend who still walked beside him. The aliens felt a strange pressure behind their eyes, a weight, not physical, but emotional, like something pressing inward from a space they had never known and could not map. They had seen species grieve before they had studied the customs of the mourning. They had documented funeral rites of hundreds of cultures. But this was not death. This was the edge between life and whatever came after. Larn stood frozen, unable to look away. His recorder now lowered his data slate, untouched, his eyes locked on the faces of these humans as they turned toward the fire. Some whispered to it, others stared into it in silence. And one young woman laughed, not out of joy, but out of something that lived beside sorrow, like two beasts that hunted together. One soldier stood tall, then suddenly dropped to his knees and placed his forehead on the ground. He began to speak to someone, not present, someone who had perhaps never existed outside his own memory, but the tone of his words made every other voice fall silent, as if something sacred was being said, something none dared interrupt. An observer near Larn began to tremble, not out of fear, but something close to disorientation, a sense that the rules they believed in, the pillars of control and reason, were slipping from beneath their feet, because these humans were not preparing for battle in any known sense. They were not bracing, they were not hardening, they were not becoming cold, they were becoming more alive. Their eyes were not empty, they were filled with stories, faces long gone, sounds remembered from childhood, fears once faced in silence now brought to the surface and laid bare before war. And the most unsettling part was the calm with which they did it, the acceptance, the deliberate stepping into a place of pain and shadow, not to escape it, but to carry it forward. Young human passed by the aliens. Without glancing at them, he held a small burning object in one hand, and in the other, a blade, not for battle, not for killing, but for ritual. He sliced a small cut across his palm and let the blood fall into the fire, his face unreadable. And when he turned to walk away, the alien standing closest to him took a step back, unable to speak, unable to breathe properly. This was not violence, it was not madness, it was not chaos. It was clarity born of experience and trauma, shaped into ritual through Years and generations, something these humans had carried, since the first time one of them picked up a stone in defense of their kin, and the ritual had grown like roots beneath their skin, never forgotten, always present. Larn tried to speak to one of the humans, a quiet request to explain what this was, why they did it, but the human only looked at him. Eyes like coals burned low and steady, and said only this: "Because if we do not face it before we fight, it will destroy us after." And then the human turned and walked back to the circle, leaving Larn with those words echoing through his mind, echoing louder than any weapon, louder than any scream from a battlefield. And in that moment, Larn knew this ritual was not for the dead, it was for the living, a shield not of metal, but of memory. As the fire grew higher and the smoke wrapped around the circle, the observers could feel the shift. Not just in the air, but in the humans themselves. A kind of silence began to rise. One that did not come from peace, but from purpose, the kind of silence that walks beside death and never looks away. The firelight burned deep into the night, casting long moving shadows across the ground where boots had stamped purpose into the dust, and ash still drifted slowly through the air like whispers from forgotten memories. The humans stood around the flame, unmoving, not frozen but grounded, as if the fire itself held them in place, not with force, but with understanding, with remembrance, with weight that did not crush but carried. And the alien observers watched in silence, unable to find the words to describe what they were feeling. No signal had been given, no commander had shouted, no order had passed through the ranks, yet each soldier began to perform action so personal, so deliberate, that even the data-gathering minds of the observers could not reduce them into patterns. One removed the chest plate of his armor, revealing scars both old and new, tracing them with black paint in shapes that could only be understood by him. Another took a sharp object from his belt and carved the symbol into a piece of wood, placing it gently beside the fire, as if offering it to someone unseen. An older human knelt with eyes closed and both hands raised to the sky, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with such emotion that it cut through the air without volume. And his words spoke of choices made, lives lost, pain held deep and forgiven, but never forgotten. Another human sat with legs crossed, eyes open and unmoving, staring straight into the flames as if they were showing him something only he could see. Aliens shifted restlessly, not from impatience, but from discomfort, a kind that did not come from outside, but from within. Their thoughts felt tangled, heavy, spiraling through loops that led back to questions they had never considered and could not answer. Why was this necessary? What was the purpose? What did it achieve? What kind of warrior ritual involved a soft breaking of the self instead of hardening it? One of the observers stepped forward slightly, his voice thin and uncertain, as he asked a human nearby what this was meant to prepare them for, what advantage it gave them in battle. And the human did not answer with words. He simply turned his hand palm up, showing a tattoo marked with 4 names, and then he pointed to 4 helmets placed at the base of the effigy, each burned slightly, each scarred by time and fire. And the alien understood not the meaning of the names, but the reason behind the ritual. It was not about strength. It was about holding on to what must never be let go. Then came a moment that shook even Larn, the leader who had come here with calm curiosity and open logic. One of the humans stood in the center and began to speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a slow, even voice. He spoke of the first time he had faced death, of how he had seen a friend fall, of how he had carried that friend's helmet for days, refusing to leave it behind, and when he finally did bury it, he placed beside it a piece of himself, not flesh, not blood, but memory. He said that every time he prepared for battle, he returned to that place inside himself and built a space where the fallen lived, not just in pictures, not just in names, but in fire and in song and in silence and in pain. And that the ritual was not about moving on, it was about moving forward with them, with all of them. Another soldier rose and began to drum, not on an instrument but on his chest, with open hands, slow, steady like a heartbeat. Others joined in, and the rhythm grew, spreading like a pulse across the field, and some humans began to move, not dancing Exactly, not marching, but swaying slowly, eyes closed, hands open, as if reaching through time, and the aliens watching felt a pull inside them, as if the rhythm spoke to something buried in their own ancient past, something they had long forgotten. Larn felt his hands tremble, the recorder long forgotten at his side, his mind unable to hold the tide of thoughts and sensations washing through him. He felt as though he stood not on a battlefield, but in a place of memory and myth, where the line between the living and the dead blurred, not in fear but in unity. The humans were not preparing for battle, they were becoming. I've looked at one of his companions who had fallen to their knees not out of injury, but out of something unspoken, eyes wide, breathing uneven, and another had stepped back completely pale, unsure whether to flee or continue watching, because what they were seeing was no longer just ritual, it was revelation, and revelation often shattered before it built. The fire crackled louder as more offerings were thrown into it, letters written by hand, torn into strips, and fed to the flames, locks of hair, bits of old uniforms, medals, ribbons, and even once a single tear carefully caught in a cloth and pressed into the center of the circle, as though it too held power. And it did not matter whether any god or force received these gifts, because they were not given in faith, they were given in memory. One soldier lit a small lantern and carried it slowly around the circle, whispering to each of his comrades a different name. Each name met with a nod or a brief touch to the chest, and when he finished, he placed the lantern at the front of the effigy and bowed low before stepping back into the shadows. Larn felt something deep inside him give way, not break, not collapse, but shift, and movement so subtle yet so permanent he knew he would never again see war the same way. And the most terrifying part was not the fire or the pain or even the sorrow. It was the calm. It was the way the humans walked into the heart of their pain and stood tall without blinking. They had not been hardened by war, they had been hollowed by it, and then filled again with something not of rage, not of hatred, but of memory and fire. And as the fire rose higher, reaching toward the stars, the observers stood silent, knowing they had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. First light of morning did not arrive gently. The sky remained dark as smoke clung to the edges of the horizon, and the glow of distant fires painted the clouds with colors that had no warmth. But the humans moved anyway, not with urgency, not with panic, but with a silence so complete it seemed to mute the very air around them. One by one, they extinguished the flames of the ritual space, not with water or tools, but with their own hands, covering the embers with earth and dust, closing the ceremony with the same care one gives to a grave. Effigy stood tall for a moment, longer, blackened and charred, and then it was brought down, not destroyed, but laid flat upon the ground as if given rest. And the soldiers saluted, not in unison, not with fanfare, but each in their own way. A nod, a whisper, a touch of the hand to the heart, and without being told, without signal or sound, they turned and began to move toward the waiting war machines. The alien observers stood to the side, unmoving, as the humans passed by, row after row of them, faces, painted eyes, sharp mouths, set into expressions of deep stillness, not emotionless, but balanced, controlled, shaped by something more than discipline. And Larn watched each of them as they walked, their armor worn, their weapons heavy, yet their steps never faltered, not once. A strange quiet settled over the camp, as if the earth itself respected what was happening. The loud hum of the war engines had started their rumble, spreading across the field like thunder in slow motion, but even that sound seemed distant in the presence of the human warriors, some of whom stopped for only a breath before boarding the transport. Some whispered words toward the sky, others toward the ground, and still others said nothing at all. One soldier walked past the observers and dropped something at Larn's feet, a small object, round and smooth, and covered in markings. It was a stone, dark in color, with 4 lines carved across it, and one small dot placed at the center. And the human did not explain its meaning, did not pause to look back, only walked on into the fog that now crept along the lower ridges of the camp like the breath of an unseen force. The observers picked up the stone, passed it between them, tried to analyze it to decode its message, but found nothing familiar. No logic, no math, no signal, and yet somehow they all agreed without speaking that the object meant something deep, something more than simple symbolism. Human vehicles began to move, grinding through the cracked and broken terrain toward the front lines, not in a line, not in a parade, but like a wave of living stone, each one different, each one silent inside, but from the outside filled with the same fierce stillness that had burned within the ritual fire larn. Finally turned to one of the commanders, a human who had remained behind briefly to ensure no one was left, and asked the question he had been holding for hours. He asked why the ritual mattered, why so much emotion was carried to the edge of death instead of being left behind. The commander looked at him with tired eyes, not unkind, but distant, as though his mind lived in two places at once. He said, "We do not fight because we hate the enemy. We fight because we remember who we lost. We carry them with us into every battle, so they don't die twice, once in body and once in memory." And then he walked away, leaving Larn standing beside the dying embers of the effigy with no answer that could fit inside any report. The alien team remained at the base, as instructed, not allowed to follow into the battlefield, not because they were unwelcome, but because what came next was not meant to be witnessed by those who had not walked through the fire, not meant for those who had not faced the ritual and felt its weight. From a distant hill, the observers watched the human units spread across the broken land like pieces of a larger storm, not moving fast, but moving with certainty, their presence changing the shape of the battlefield before a single shot had been fired. The alien scanners picked up the energy signals of the enemy, moving closer, a swarm of synthetic life, brutal and efficient, without emotion, without hesitation, and yet something shifted in the data, something subtle and strange. The enemy formations paused just before contact. Their machines scanned the terrain, analyzed the data, calculated outcomes, and yet for reasons unknown to the observers, the enemy did not press forward, not immediately. Instead they repositioned slowly, cautiously, as if they too could sense that the humans had brought something more than weapons, more than tactics, more than numbers. Observers watched with a growing sense of unease, not fear of death, but fear of understanding. They were beginning to see that war for humans was not simply an event or a strategy or a duty. It was something lived. It was something woven through their thoughts and blood and breath, something that gave shape to their sorrow and power to their purpose. Larn stood apart from the others, watching not with data screens or sensors, but with his own eyes, searching the field for the moment when noise would replace silence, when the fire they had witnessed would become something else, something unstoppable. And in that waiting, something inside him shifted again. He no longer questioned the ritual, not because he understood it fully, but because he had seen its truth, and truth did not always need to be explained to be real. And as the first sound of impact rose from the far edge of the field, a dull, distant roar, like the cracking of mountains, the alien observers remained silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had already heard all they needed to. In the silence that came before, the sound of battle had passed like a wave crashing over the edge of a world that could no longer hold it. The sky had turned darker, and the ground had shaken, until even the deepest cracks seemed ready to split open. But now the silence had returned, not the silence of peace, but the silence left behind by the storm, when everything that could be broken already lay in pieces, and the echoes no longer answered back. The alien observers remained at the edge of the field, where the smoke drifted slowly across the broken machines and shattered armor, and the dust of movement still floated in the air, carrying with it the heavy taste of metal and ash and memory. They had watched the battle from their vantage point, unable to intervene, only able to record and understand. And even now, as the first human units returned, their minds could not fully process what they had seen. The enemy had fought with precision, with brutal force and overwhelming numbers. Yet the humans had held their ground, not with superior weapons, not with overwhelming strength, but with a strange force that came from somewhere invisible, a fire that never flickered, a unity that could not be explained, and the machines of the enemy had paused, hesitated, faltered as if they too had seen something they could not name, and now the survivors returned, their armor cracked, their faces smeared with blood and dust and soot, their bodies marked by pain, but their eyes still clear, still burning, still alive. They moved slowly but not broken, carrying the wounded, lifting the fallen, not with panic or despair, but with a deep, quiet strength. And among them the observers saw faces they recognized from the ritual, not smiling, not weeping, but present, fully present in Azuma. Every step the field beyond them was filled with the wreckage of war, but also with something more, something unspoken, that lingered like a scent in the wind, or a shadow at the corner of vision. It was the weight of what had been carried, the memory of what had been faced, and the unbroken link between the living and the dead one. Humans stood at the edge of the field, holding a helmet against his chest, eyes fixed on the horizon where the smoke still curled upward like a signal, and after a long pause he placed the helmet gently on the ground and walked away, not looking back, not because he had forgotten, but because he had already said goodbye. Larn and the other observers moved through the field with careful steps, passing between the bodies of machines and men, their senses overwhelmed by the aftermath, not just the destruction, but the quiet reverence in the way the humans treated every fragment, every trace, as if even the smallest piece held a name or a story that must not be lost. A group of soldiers gathered in a circle near the center of the ruined ground, not to celebrate, not to plan, not to rest, but to speak softly, to call out names one by one, and to light small fires that flickered like stars fallen to earth. And Larn realized this was another ritual, not of preparation, but of remembrance, not performed for others to see, but for themselves to heal. One of the younger observers approached a soldier who sat alone, holding a photograph and shaking hands, and asked what the picture meant, and the soldier answered in a voice that trembled like a wind through broken glass. He said, "This is my brother. He died last year, and every time I fight I bring him with me, so he can come home too." Answer left the observer quiet, unable to respond, because nothing in the databases, nothing in the histories, nothing in the archives had ever prepared them for that kind of truth, the kind that did not shout but lived in the smallest actions, the kind that turned memory into strength and sorrow into courage. When the human command center was re-established, the alien observers were allowed inside to speak with the surviving officers, and what they found was not pride, not anger, not even relief. It was reflection. It was the weight of choices made and losses carried and victories earned, not through force, but through will. Larn submitted his report 3 days later, not a document of numbers or tactics or weapon effectiveness, but a series of thoughts, a record of understanding written in words that carried weight instead of calculations. He wrote that the humans did not fight because they believed in destruction, but because they refused to forget, because they remembered every loss, every name, every silence, and turned those things into purpose. He wrote that their strength did not come from rage, but from meaning, from bonds that went beyond command, beyond strategy, beyond logic, and that their rituals were not madness, but a kind of armor far stronger than metal. He ended the report with a warning, not of danger, but of truth. And in that truth a lesson. He wrote, "Do not judge the species by the way they fight, judge them by the way they prepare for battle, and the way they carry their dead. They do not raise weapons to conquer, they raise them to protect what they cannot bear to lose again." When the High Council of his world read the report, they made no comment, but they closed the file under a seal reserved for matters of cultural risk and long-term consequence. And from that day forward, their dealings with humanity shifted not with fear, but with respect, and in a quiet room far from the battlefield, Larn placed the small stone given to him by the soldier on a shelf where no one else would touch it. He did not know its full meaning, but he knew it mattered. He knew it had been given not as a message but as a memory. And as the stars turned and the wars continued across distant systems, one truth remained unchanged, written not in fire or blood, but in silence. You may understand their weapons, you may study their tactics, but you will never understand their willen. That is why they endure TNG end.